The average person might be led to believe that Illinois completely legalized cannabis in 2020.
As you know, it'll become official January 1st, Illinois becoming the 11th state in the union to legalize adult-use recreational marijuana.
Illinois became the 11th state to legalize recreational cannabis.
It will be legal to buy marijuana in Illinois.
This is the story about how Illinois failed to achieve meaningful reform in their cannabis policy.
Just seems like there are a lot of gray areas there.
Well, yeah, in the case of the woman whose home keeps getting raided, she's like, well, why are they busting in my door after midnight over something that Illinois says is legal?
Right.
And I want to highlight that in its first year of legalized recreational marijuana in the state of Illinois, they arrested 3 times as many black people for possession than any other race. So we're still seeing this level of inequity, discrepancy that we were seeing even before this move to decriminalize and legalize, which are 2 separate things. That's not, they don't mean the same thing, which I think is really important.
We've run into so much cannabis, we've run out of places to put it.
Why are they arresting so many black people for something that seems to be legal there?
The promise to legalize. A pivotal issue emerged in the 2018 gubernatorial race in Illinois, the legalization of marijuana.
Should recreational marijuana be legal in Illinois? Voters thought so.
At the time, people in the state of Illinois were increasingly supportive of reforming the laws surrounding the legality of cannabis.
It's consistent with what we've seen in other statewide polls as well, that at least 2/3 of Illinoisans support and think we should tax and regulate cannabis like we do alcohol.
Bruce Rauner, the incumbent governor, made it clear that he opposed the idea of legalization.
I do not support legalizing marijuana for recreational use.
Wait, do I need to fix my hair or anything?
Meanwhile, contender J.B. Pritzker made clear his outspoken support of legalization on the campaign trail.
It's time for Illinois to end marijuana prohibition and enter the 21st century. For far too long, marijuana laws have led to discrimination and injustice.
Once elected, Governor Pritzker reaffirmed his campaign promise during his inaugural address.
I will work with the legislature to legalize, tax, and regulate the sale of recreational cannabis in Illinois.
After the election of J.B. Pritzker, the excitement for cannabis legalization in Illinois officially began.
A Pritzker win means a win for pot. The push to legalize marijuana in Illinois gets a huge boost as it's supported by the state's next governor.
January 1st, what should we expect?
The end of prohibition. This is a sea change in Illinois. So this will be the first time in almost 80-something years that cannabis won't be illegal anymore, at least at the state level. So we're the 11th state. The biggest thing that we need people to understand is that January 1, in terms of the criminal justice system here in this state, is the end of prohibition.
Citizens quickly came to realize a sobering truth. There are limitations to legalization in Illinois, and unfortunately, exceeding those limitations still results in criminal penalties.
This plan would make marijuana legal, but would not remove all of the consequences. Explain that for us.
One example is that you still could lose your job if you fail a drug test testing positive for marijuana. Police could also arrest you if you had too much marijuana on you.
It's crazy that in this state where we say, oh, weed is legal now, people can still get a mandatory minimum of 6 years for having too much cannabis. I don't know what that is. Cannabis has never killed anybody. So there should really be no limit on how much you can have. The only reason there is because companies like this feel threatened because that would legalize their competition. And now they have the police to enforce and eliminate that competition. So if we're going to be the most socially equitable cannabis market in the country, we should probably stop putting people in jail, stop giving people felonies. If you grow over 5 plants, it's a felony. If you have over 100 grams of weed, it's a felony. If you sell over 10 grams of weed, it's a felony. They need to actually repeal the criminal code around cannabis, not just make little exceptions to it for people that use a little bit.
You could even get a ticket for smoking at home if there are people outside who can see you.
Problem is we're in a state where we say it's legal. We say we're progressive on cannabis, but we still have more ways now to get in trouble, criminal trouble for cannabis than we did before 2020.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is the problem.
While the state is seeing green, some are seeing red at the mixed messages on marijuana. In 2019, the governor made good on a campaign promise, signing a bill to legalize recreational marijuana.
As we stand here on this historic occasion,
the change in law brought lines outside dispensaries and a windfall of $162 million in tax revenue for the state. But according to law enforcement, what legalization has not done is put drug dealers out of business.
Despite the legalization of cannabis, the black market for cannabis has absolutely continued to thrive.
Police say it's a matter of simple economics.
So they can sell it for quite a bit less than what they're selling at the dispensary, and they're putting more money in their pocket.
We just keep running across it, so my numbers they're high.
So much so, they're running out of space.
So this is one of our storage areas that we had to come up with. We've run into so much cannabis over the last year that we've run out of places to put it.
Most of it intercepted on its way from the West Coast, brought here by road or rail, and sometimes hidden in containers like this one.
This is about a pound here. And inside the container that it was in, there was over 1,000 pounds of child's play set. That's what was being shipped across country.
With 1,000 pounds of marijuana inside.
There is a lot of high quality marijuana and other THC products coming in through the black market.
So, where did Illinois go wrong?
There's still penalties involved and included in this bill that could result in criminal action against people who may not understand what legalization actually means in implementation form.
Why are they arresting so many black people for something that seems to be legal there?
Because it's $1 billion industry for this state, and because the state wants to protect its revenue stream that it's getting from the legalized sale at dispensaries. That's why.
Is it actually legal?
So there are still possession. If you read the statute, there were possession limits put in the statute.
The program also includes regulation on possession limits.
So people can still be arrested for a possession if they, go beyond the illegal amount. So things are legalized, but it's not legalized completely. I don't know that we need to continue to put limitations on possession as we move forward. But as of now, and based on statute, that would be illegal to have a certain level or possession amount.
It's important to understand that small amounts of cannabis had been decriminalized by then Governor Bruce Rauner in 2016, almost 4 years prior to the new law taking effect. Under that system, possession of 10 grams or less of cannabis was punishable by a small civil fine between $100 and $200. According to legal professionals, under this old system, possession of a few grams more than the legal limit of 10 grams simply incurred a small civil fine. Under the new law, however, possession of a few grams over the legal limit, let's say 32 grams, is not punishable by a small civil fine, but a Class A misdemeanor and up to a year in jail.
Right to jail, right away.
There's something wrong. Make it a fine-only offense, I guess. I mean, if you want to make it I don't think you should make it an offense at all.
Sure.
But if you do want to make it an offense, do we really have no tools other than criminal law?
Right.
Give them a ticket. All of these criminal laws still exist.
Mm-hmm.
They're all still enforced. To fall back into the criminal law, the pre-existing criminal law that uses jail time and probation and high fines as a mechanism of enforcement, we're not being progressive.
Yeah.
We're saying we're progressive as a state on cannabis, but we're obviously not living up to that if our only tool for enforcement is criminal law.
Before the Illinois legislature voted on a proposal to tax and regulate cannabis, State Representative Carol Ammons publicly voiced concerns about the legislation. She indicated that if Illinois were to pass this into law, that the state would fail to fully legalize cannabis.
I think it's a step forward in the right direction, but it does not completely legalize marijuana in the state of Illinois. And so I was really concerned about that, and I wanted to make sure that the public understood that the bill itself still included points where criminalization could take place.
I thought that when we pass legislative measures, we would legalize completely, which we have not done. And we've seen people continuously be charged with having too many plants in their basement. The reality is, if you say this thing is legal, if I can grow 6 broccoli plants and nobody come and arrest me for it, why can't I grow 6 marijuana plants in my backyard? Why would I be arrested for that? except that the cannabis industry that is able to make it illegal for me to do what I'm doing so that they can corner the market. That's all it is. And we've seen this over and over and over again in so many ways.
According to the Chicago Tribune, early drafts of the Illinois Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act included provisions which would allow all adults to cultivate cannabis at home. But this language was ultimately removed from the final language of the law due to objections from licensed cannabis cultivators and law enforcement. Currently, only medical cannabis patients are allowed to grow cannabis at home, and even then, the activity is heavily regulated with strict penalties for non-compliance.
If we just shut down the idea of home grow, that's wrong. The fact that a person actually grows cannabis at their home, and to think that we can actually send the police there to arrest them, and if growing a plant of cannabis is something that they enjoy, they should be able to do it.
The way I like to say it, and I want to see if you're down with this, I always say cannabis is not legal until we can grow, possess, use as much as we want, need, or please.
Wow. People would say, well, that means that we can have cannabis growing in fields like corn. Would that be okay? I mean, would it hurt anybody?
I think there have been kind of a understanding amongst people that decriminalization is like a step towards legalization. And my take on it, after having seen Illinois, which claims to be one of the most progressive states on cannabis, decriminalization is the goal beyond legalization. So what legalization did in Illinois is it did not repeal any cannabis law. That might be legalization, but it's not decriminalization because all of the crimes still exist. Pretty innocuous, innocent use or possession of cannabis. It has the exact same penalties and consequences as it did before legalization because maybe you have not stayed on the tightrope as much as you should. Even since the last time we talked, I've talked with prosecutors about this, and the attitude I've gotten is like, how hard is it just to obey our rules? Which has always been the case. How hard is it just not to smoke cannabis? Mm-hmm. How hard is it just not to possess it? I don't want you to come crying to me.
So the tightrope, it's hard to stay on the tightrope. Definitely in many cases it's hard, and we can talk about that. But in some cases, my favorite one that we'll be talking about today, it's arguably impossible.
Right.
And I'm talking about
Illinois Supreme Court will soon decide whether the smell of pot is enough reason for police to search a car.
Even if, say, the driver were to say, yeah, it's right here. I have the cannabis in this old prescription pill container, which is child resistant. It's got the child resistant top. It's sealed. Is that not good enough? If the officer says, I can smell it, the officer can then effectuate an arrest, put the person in handcuffs, take them to jail, make them post bond because they've committed a Class A misdemeanor punishable by a year in jail. So the point of this whole rant that I'm going on is that we have a law in Illinois that says that you can possess and transport cannabis in a vehicle, but only if it can't be smelled. I think it's just a skeleton key for probable cause. It's just a probable cause generator for police. And before you accuse me of being conspiratorial or, being a whack job who thinks that this is all some dark magic to give police probable cause, I've seen it. I've represented people and taken their cases through the court system who got charged with more serious crimes only because the police said that they smelled cannabis. And not because the police said you have illegal cannabis.
Right.
Or not because you have too much cannabis. Or not because you're high on cannabis. Mm-hmm. But because I can smell it, and that's it. So that's where we're at right now in Illinois.
Yeah.
And I hope it changes.
Just to put a finer point on that, something you've mentioned and I've experienced is independently, so I don't think it can be totally chalked up to anecdote. If you've purchased a product from a legal dispensary, those containers are not odor-proof.
Not even close. Some of their cannabis that I've bought before is in a glass jar. It's like a little glass jar that you might get a cosmetic in.
Yeah.
Kind of a loose fitting plastic cap.
Right.
You put that in your car and come back in a half hour, you can smell it easily. Mm-hmm. And if it's 90 degrees outside, it smells like, Cheech and Chong's lowrider. It's way over the top smelly.
Hey man, am I driving okay? I think we're parked, man.
The fact that arrests are still happening, that does point to the fact, and you looked at this as well, the illicit market remains strong. And a lot of people, different depending on the demographic, but a lot of people are still turning to that illegal market to obtain their cannabis, right?
That's correct. The Tribune did a nice story a couple years back. Their angle on this was that the arrests in Chicago were occurring in places where there weren't dispensaries. So we took another look at that again. We updated that information and found that that's still the case. And that suggests that one reason that people turn to the illegal market is that it's just more convenient for them. They don't have a dispensary near where they live. And unfortunately, at least that's true in Chicago, the lack of dispensaries happens to be in neighborhoods that are primarily ethnic minorities and poorer neighborhoods. That's still a concerning issue. And one of the criticisms of Illinois' tax act, the Cannabis Tax Act, is that the taxes are so high that cannabis is more expensive to get in a dispensary, even if you have one convenient to you. And so it's actually just cheaper to go and buy it from your local dealer who you may have been buying it from for years. And so we found that those are several of the reasons that people continue to buy illegally: convenience, price, and having a trusted dealer that they've used for a long time.
Attorney goes, he understands that he can't be smoking and his cannabis flower shouldn't be open. And I was like, I'd like to say for the record that I was not smoking and my flower was not open.
Listen to stories from people affected by the ongoing criminalization of cannabis in Illinois at colememo.com/isitlegal.
I have been a staunch opposition to any cannabis legislative initiative that does not go back and fix the original problems.
Legal experts tell me that the root of this issue is the primary enforcement mechanism for the legal cannabis system in Illinois, which is the Cannabis Control Act of 1978. So, in order to address the systemic problems caused by the criminalization of cannabis, we need to completely repeal this act. Until then, Illinois cannot claim to be addressing the harms of cannabis prohibition because they're still leaning on the same exact enforcement practices from that era. You might be wondering, is there any hope for meaningful reform in Illinois cannabis policy? I took the time to ask renowned legal experts, and here's what they had to say. What's the outlook on repealing the Cannabis Control Act of 1978? What's the outlook on making things like home grow legal and removing arcane ideas of possession limits? Bob, do you still feel like the chances are low because that's a competitor to their revenue stream?
Big time. There's no way the General Assembly is going to fall.
What about you, Attorney Bruno? Do you think meaningful reform, as you refer to it as, is seen as competition to the bottom line of the state and these operators?
Of course, yeah. It would have been easier to do 10 years ago than it is now.
Recreational cannabis has been legal in Illinois for more than 2 years, and yet thousands of residents are still waiting to get their records cleared. Advocates say a pot testing requirement has been slowing down the process. State Representative Carol Ammons says cannabis should not be a barrier to expungement if it's not a barrier to selling it.
More than 2 years into legalization, people attempting to expunge their cannabis records were being prevented by a drug testing requirement, which stipulated that they couldn't get their records expunged unless they passed a drug test for cannabis. Fortunately, the legislation Representative Ammons referred to in the clip that you just heard was ultimately signed into law by Governor J.B. Pritzker, effectively addressing an issue that remained untouched from the original bill to tax and regulate cannabis. Let's take a moment to examine the foundation of the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act.
In hindsight, a lot of states got it wrong on licensing because their programs ended up with the unintended consequence of a consolidated marketplace where only a few profit. And those communities that have been hurt are on the outside looking in. To start, for those who want to get a license, we're creating a designation for social equity applicants. Our approach makes Illinois the first state in the nation to place status as a social equity applicant into the core scoring system for applications.
In 2021, Illinois used a points-based evaluation for its recreational cannabis licenses. It allocated a limited number of licenses per region. Chicago had 47. The first step to securing a license was getting into the lottery. The number of points earned on an application determined eligibility. Categories had defined values. Social equity was worth 50 points, knowledge and experience, 30. And there were 5 points for U.S. veteran status.
The maximum number of points you could earn was 250.
From the governor, an admission. This first round of application scoring has been far from perfect.
The story of cannabis licensing in Illinois is extensive, well-documented, and filled with conflict and conspiracy. Because of this, I can't skip over this part of the story entirely, but I will be candid in saying that I'll just be scratching the surface because it can be easy to get into the mud on this particular part of the story. If you've noticed, I've provided citations for everything covered in this documentary so far. For those who want to dig deeper, check out the bibliography at the end of this presentation or visit colememo.com/history. There you'll find more of my research on Illinois cannabis policy, including interviews with advocates and activists from the 1970s and 1980s to the 2000s and modern day. Once again, that's colememo.com/history. So, right out of the gate, the state of Illinois was under fire for a controversy surrounding the initial round of cannabis licensing. Before we move on, let's briefly listen to professional journalists that reported on the initial round of cannabis licensing in Illinois.
What was announced was the results of the dispensary scoring process for the 75 licenses. We never got an exact number from the state, but we were told over 700 applicants submitted over 4,000 applications. And the key thing is that you could submit multiple applications. You could submit an application for every one of the 75 licenses if you chose. Some places actually did that. Most applicants submitted multiple applications. The big surprise is that out of 700 applications, only 21 were accepted to go to the tiebreaker round, which is going to be a lottery conducted by the Illinois Lottery. And that was a shocker because of those 21 applicants, many are very well-connected, hyper-financed organizations. And it does not fall into the spirit of the process that was created by the Illinois State Legislature, which meant to give a great deal of weight to social equity applicants. In fact, it does seem that the license process favored in many ways veterans because of the way the scoring process worked. And so that was, a big shocker for a lot of people. There's a lot of dismayed and angry people with the process. They feel like they didn't get their fair share or their fair shake. And looking at applications and the information that I was provided by applicants, as well as the score sheets, it does seem that there were a significant number of errors in the scoring process. It does seem that there is some merit to concerns that the scoring process was faulty.
Like all of the world's big accounting firms, KPMG does more than sell tax advice to the rich. It also advises and sells audit services to businesses and to governments.
KPMG, an international consulting firm, was responsible for grading the cannabis applications for the state of Illinois. KPMG is no stranger to controversy.
And in 2005, Everson, together with the U.S. Attorney General, made it official.
We simply can't tolerate flagrant abuse of the law and of professional standards by tax professionals, particularly those associated with so-called blue-chip firms like KPMG.
8 former KPMG executives were charged. 3 were eventually convicted. And the company would pay nearly $500 million in fines after admitting what it did was fraud.
One of the applicants, a gentleman named Hamid Kamal, he is part of a team that also includes former Chicago Police Superintendent Terry Hilliard. Hamid Kamal applied as part of this team, and Hamid is a risk consultant for KPMG. And sometimes was able to get KPMG to confirm that he is an employee with them, although KPMG says, well, he's not involved with the scoring process. That is a real black eye for KPMG and also for Hamid Kamal. I'm surprised that KPMG didn't have a policy against their employees applying, and I'm surprised that the state didn't include a policy as part of their contract. The KPMG employees could not apply.
I mean, it's an interesting thing because, these little details about what happened with the KPMG thing have kind of filtered out weirdly. But right, like the flash drive thing, like that they couldn't get the applications off the flash drives. The explanation was like they couldn't send people to get the flash drives initially because there was like a travel ban. Like that was part of what the explanation was. But like it seemed like the issue with the flash drive was kind of deeper than that they like couldn't extract the actual like data off of the flash.
Yeah.
And then like KPMG had to send like a tech guru or something to like the Geek Squad to like come fix it or something. Yeah, really is a fascinating story. I think the last thing that I wrote, like KPMG's contracts for like the ag department and the IDFPR, which were no bid contracts, like have jumped in value to around $14 million now. But this subcontractor who did all this initial work only got $700,000. And like this subcontractor is this company, I think it's called Indelible Solutions. And yeah, like they briefly trained some workers, and then the workers had like this daunting task of like sifting through these really complicated applications that included like tons of documentation.
Again, that was just high-level coverage of that entire situation. The state of Illinois was asked about this situation. Here's how they responded.
Was it a mistake to allow the same company to buy multiple applications at once?
Yeah, the first change that we have to fix is the amount of applications you can put in at one time. Because of what we've seen and the fact that there's only 21 entities in this thing, and that we were all shocked by the few number of entities, even though they represent a large group of applications, we knew that there was going to be a lot of disappointment because there were only 75 licenses we were giving. So when you have an application pool that's 4,518 applications for 75 licenses, I think everybody going in knew that there was a much stronger chance that they weren't going to get the license than that they would.
Those investors with deep pockets know that one immutable truth, I suppose, is that cash is king, and that if they could sort of stack the odds in their favor, of course, why not? If you have that disposable income or that available capital.
When the average person looks at how cannabis licensing works in Illinois and compares it to how we license other legal businesses, they naturally arrive at this question.
Why set a cap on the number of applications at all? There was an article in Crane's Chicago Business that raises this point and says a better approach would be to remove the cap on licenses while adopting a set of reasonable licensing standards meant to ensure the solvency and integrity of the industry. Anybody who meets those standards should get a license. That was the argument in Crane's. I suppose to ask the question a different way, if there's this much interest, this many business owners, entrepreneurs who want in on the market, they think they can do it, why keep them out?
The most important thing in all of this, which is protect market share.
The state of Illinois has paired the idea of social equity with the concept of market share.
Right, but market share for who? And if you're talking about you want to have it like broadly spread among a diverse group of operators, the way to do that would be to open up licensing completely so that anyone could get one. You would just want to limit how much market share any one person or entity can have, right? So no one person can dominate too much of the market. You can still have people who are bigger than other people. Some people will fail. That's one of the problems with how Illinois set it up is they seem to almost want to guarantee that no one will fail. That like, if you got a license, you were guaranteed generational wealth, which are the words they used, and that's just a bad promise to make, because in any kind of market, even in one as tightly regulated as this and as limited as this, there are going to be people who go out of business. So the social equity is to repair the harms of the war on drugs. But in Illinois, we still have harms of the war on drugs because cannabis is still largely criminalized. So if you limit the licenses and you've given out all the licenses you can give out, but you're still arresting people for cannabis and putting them in jail, how are you going to make the rights for those wrongs? It just doesn't make sense.
Do we pick out another batch of golden ticket winners to offset the damage we've done and continue to do?
Well, repair the harms of the war on drugs, but you have to take part in this lottery for that to happen.
Representative Ammons, what would a truly equitable cannabis program look like to you?
I think we would start by fulfilling the promise that was made when you passed legalization in the first place. I think a truly equitable program has to remove all criminal penalties in relationship to the legal substance that you are allowing to be sold and taxed in your state. And so for you to do anything less than that creates the disenfranchisement of certain people in the process, and it certainly does not lend to a truly equitable, social equitable program that we sold to the people of Illinois.
I feel social equity, it includes giving people licenses and the support they need because they've been disadvantaged by the war on drugs, right? What better way to address social equity than ending the war on drugs?
Oh my goodness.
From my perspective, it seems like from the licensee's perspective, they see further decriminalization as competition to their market share. How do we address that?
The problem with that is the people with the money, the majority owners in this space, they did just a little to push for a little decrim so that they could make a lot of money. We need them to be on board with full decriminalization. But remember, we tried in Illinois, people all over the country have tried to do decrim of cannabis for years.
Yeah.
Even the small amounts that we got in the Cannabis Act in Illinois, I tried to do that when I first got in probably 2007. It didn't make sense to anyone then until the money people came and said, you know what, why don't we get some people on our side? And who do we get on our side? People that have criminal records. And we're going to use that as a opportunity to get people to say, yes, I want to pass this bill because they're going to decrim and they're going to expunge records. While all along, they know that they're about to make billions of dollars. So what we need to do is get those billionaires and multimillionaires that's making money off of cannabis to join the effort for full decrim.
You know, I get flack sometimes because I have pointed out that they've lobbied against homegrown in the past, and some people are like, well, they didn't all lobby against homegrown. I'm like, well, they didn't. They certainly aren't at the front of the crowd saying, let's do it. So that's a problem. They should be ahead of everybody else.
That's right. And they have the money and the resources and the knowledge about this, and they should help decrim across the country.
You know, the fact that these big cannabis companies that operate like these MSOs, the fact that limited licensing is their preferred market to operate in should maybe suggest that limited licensing isn't the way to go if you want to have a broadly prosperous, like accessible market. Limited licensing and social equity are kind of mutually exclusive in that regard. They can't really exist in the same place.
I love Venn diagrams. It's just something about those three circles and the analysis about where there is the intersection, right? Yeah, I see people that you agree with me, right?
Social equity is not a guarantor of success. What social equity is, it's the opportunity to fail like everyone else and not to be kept out of a business opportunity because of socioeconomic or criminal history, et cetera, et cetera. It's a chance to stand up and fail just like everyone else. Or they would say, hey, social equity applicant, here's your store. We've already built it. Here's the money to run it. Have a great fucking day.
This limited approach is preferred by the originally established licensees because
the answer to how to keep profits and prevent competition in the market is
limited licenses.
Limited licenses and
limited license markets. Why go play in a knife fight when it's easier to go sit at the beach?
In other words, they'll use the law to give themselves monopoly.
There are a lot of questions left unanswered, but there's one thing we know for sure. Something stinks, and it's not the marijuana. This process is so overtly corrupt, so indefensible, it would make Rod Blagojevich blush.
Now take Curaleaf and Green Thumb Industries, two of the biggest cannabis corporations. Now here's what they're telling investors. Curaleaf says that it, quote, maintains an operational footprint of primarily limited licensed states with natural high barriers to entry and limited market participants, end quote. Now that's an annoying corporate speak way of saying they want monopoly power. Green Thumb Industries says it is seeking to operate in, quote, limited supply markets, end quote. I'd say slightly shorter, but equally annoying way of saying the same thing.
It was one of the very unique components of the Illinois bill is we're gonna have the first limited license adult use program in the country. And it was built on the back of the medical program. And the medical program really did change the way that cannabis was done in the US, right? Illinois created Generation 2, which is highly regulated, compliance focused, and limited licenses. And so they kept that common thread.
The supply side on your side for now.
Yeah, again, important. We're the backbone of the current regulated medical program. It's good to, still focus on that as you develop the adult use.
I know that there are people who write about this, that there are other states that have opened up the number of licenses to hundreds and hundreds of licensees, and they have more dispensaries open than we do. But the reality is that we've limited the number of licensees in part because we wanted to make sure that the social equity licensees had a fair shot in the industry and they weren't just edged out to the very end.
A few moments later.
More than $2 billion in cannabis sales in 2 years. Legalized pot is a lucrative cash business here in Illinois, to say the least, as the state rakes in hundreds of millions in tax dollars and the same medical marijuana business owners get richer.
But I just want my shot.
All while the people Illinois promised to prioritize in its equity-focused legalization plan. People like Frank Cowan
There's no minority representation.
Are still stuck watching from the sidelines. Not one new license holder has opened up shop here because of state delays and lawsuits over how the state handled licensing.
Kudos to JB Pritzker, Governor Pritzker, for coming down with this social equity program, but it's been a complete disaster.
Not $1 of sales was documented going to black or brown owners when the study ended in 2023. Instead, white male owners took in 78% of recreational dispensary sales and 91% of grower sales.
There have been several outspoken critics of limited licensing over the years.
Nobody's asking whether or not any of this is right when you say, well, why are we only giving out 75 licenses? There's 900 people that want a license. Why aren't we giving, there's 575 frickin' Starbucks in this country, this state, and that's just a Starbucks. It's not like all coffee shops are Starbucks. How many liquor stores are in this state? Why we think that we have to limit the amount of cannabis licenses to fewer than the amount of Starbucks is beyond me.
Danielle Perry, who was appointed by Governor Pritzker to be the Cannabis Regulation Oversight Officer for the state of Illinois, is one of the only cannabis regulators in Illinois to suggest that limiting licenses may not be the best way to achieve social equity.
The truth is, I think it's a larger issue at hand. And the issue is we had an application process that was competitive. Because it's a competitive process and the goal was to get the people with the highest score, if you didn't have the highest score, you didn't get the licenses. And so I think the larger question is it important for us, and should we in the future do a competitive process with points, and should we have limited licensing? Because to me, when you have a small amount of licenses, you make it based on how well you got in the points, it usually ends up being how much money did you have to be resourced enough to support?
We knew on the front end that it was going to be impossible for those that were hardest hit by the war on drugs to be able to be owners and operators in the business.
Illinois Representative Carol Ammons had introduced a competing legalization bill that would have allowed an unlimited number of new indoor and outdoor growers, and would have required that the majority of those licenses for growers and retailers go to minorities. You actually introduced your measure to legalize cannabis, which I argue would have actually done that. Residents would have been able to grow up to 24 plants. I didn't get the impression that you would have license limitations or really continued criminalization of cannabis. The Tribune even said the measure is unlikely to pass because lawmakers are expected to act on a more restrictive proposal that's been in the works for more than a year.
That's correct.
I'm just curious, why do you think your bill didn't get widespread support, given the fact that it is a better bill? It's more progressive. It actually addresses the root problem.
I mean, the industry didn't write it. That's why.
Representative Ammons' proposal to legalize cannabis also would have prohibited any cannabis company or political action committee from making a campaign contribution to promote a candidate or public official. Ammons' bill never got past the committee level and ultimately died at the end of session. Let's set aside the topic of campaign finance for a moment. It's important to note that legalization was one of the last products of the Madigan era in Illinois politics. This often overlooked aspect of the story reveals how the legislation might have been shaped by the political climate of the time.
One thing is for sure, no bill gets passed without his blessing.
I decided years ago that I wanted to be a strong legislative leader, an active legislative leader. There have been others in the history of the legislature that took a different view. I would hope that acting from a position of strength, that I do good things, not bad things, I would hope.
Under the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Illinois, legislative bodies develop their own rules. So if you've got a leader who wants to control things and his majority is willing to let him, Illinois just has unique rules that allow one person to make a decision on whether a bill will see the light of day.
What is controlled by the speaker is basically what bills get into rules and then where they get assigned. How one passes legislation is the first thing you draft it, you get a bill number. And then that bill number has to be assigned into a committee for a hearing. And how a bill is assigned into a committee, it goes into a committee called Rules, and then Rules makes the assignment.
The Rules Committee is a catch-all committee. Typically, in most states, they're service committees. They're traffic cops to make sure bills go to the right place for the right consideration. In Illinois, it's where ideas that the Speaker and the Senate President don't like go to die. A lot of important reforms have died because the Speaker didn't want to see them move forward.
When asked about cannabis legalization, Madigan reportedly expressed concerns about the licensing process. He also had issues with parts of the legislation focused on criminal justice reform.
There are some very controversial aspects.
House Speaker Michael Madigan said Monday forgiving teenagers who screwed up is one thing, but drug dealers, entirely another.
After the heat of the legislative session, pressure began to mount on Michael Madigan as a result of his questionable conduct during his time in office.
Governor Pritzker worked with Madigan to pass a capital plan, recreational cannabis, sports betting, and a minimum wage increase.
We began the session by raising the minimum wage at the urging of the governor.
Despite the wins, the governor seemed to grow impatient with Madigan, calling on him to answer questions about ComEd, and then ultimately asking him to hand off his chairmanship. During the fall, associates of Madigan were charged with multiple counts of bribery. It became a flashpoint. A growing number of Madigan's caucus announced they would no longer support him as Speaker. An astonishing development. It seemed like the beginning of the end.
We're not planning to retire.
You have no plans at all. You're going to be there forever.
Prosecutors have indicted former Illinois House Speaker Mike Madigan. He's charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and bribery relating to a years-long scheme involving Illinois' largest electric utility. ComEd previously admitted to hiring Madigan cronies and confidants, giving them jobs and lucrative contracts to curry favor with Madigan for his support on legislation. But it doesn't end there. Prosecutors accuse Madigan of essentially running a criminal enterprise that existed to enhance his political power and financial well-being. Madigan's closest confidant, who became a ComEd lobbyist, Michael McLean, is facing charges related to the scheme. McLean is accused of directing ComEd's top officials to hire dozens of people. In each message, McLean made clear the calls were coming from above, someone simply referred to as our friend.
Green Thumb Industries, a Chicago-based marijuana cultivator and dispenser that also goes by GTI, reportedly hired Michael McLean as a consultant and lobbyist. As you just saw, McLean has been charged in an unrelated bribery conspiracy involving ComEd and Michael Madigan. GTI also engaged other lobbyists and consultants with close ties to Madigan, raising further concerns about the company's political dealings. Former Madigan aide Heather Weir-Vaught seems to run the Government Solutions Group, which includes Jay Curtis, who served as the Director of Legislative Affairs for Governor Patrick Quinn. Governor Quinn signed the Illinois Compassionate Use of Medical Cannabis program into law in 2013. According to his LinkedIn page, which I checked in September of 2024, Chad Hoosier joined the Government Solutions Group in 2022. Before then, he worked in political outreach in J.B. Pritzker's campaign for governor, and he was ultimately appointed as deputy to the senior advisor for Governor J.B. Pritzker. According to a 2021 report by the Chicago Tribune, GTI was under federal investigation for potential pay-to-play violations during its pursuit of cannabis licenses. The investigation reportedly focused on campaign donations and other efforts GTI made to secure cultivation and retail licenses in Illinois and several other states. The report by the Chicago Tribune also mentioned a lawsuit filed by a former business associate of GTI, who claimed that the founder and CEO of GTI, Ben Kovler, bragged about his political connections, stating that his relationships with influential business people and politicians in Illinois would make them a shoo-in for any licenses that they would need. Kovler has reportedly denied these accusations. According to the report, no charges had been filed, and a GTI spokeswoman reportedly stated that the company was unaware of any investigation. Now that we've discussed how the political climate in Illinois may have shaped the outcome of cannabis legalization, let's examine a factor that most certainly influenced the end result: campaign finance.
Why do you think you're alone in supporting meaningful reform?
Let's see, why am I alone? And me and Mary Flowers are two of the only ones who voted against it. Some of my colleagues regret it to this day and have shared with me personally that they regret voting for the original bill. You know, we're alone because just like any other commodity in a capitalist system, unless you deal with campaign finance, you're going to be alone.
In the past, the law expressly prohibited cannabis license holders or their political action committees from contributing to political candidates to prevent the appearance of unfair influence. That provision of the law was challenged and overturned by a federal judge in 2017. According to a review by the Chicago Tribune, cannabis companies, their executives, and lobbyists could be linked to more than $630,000 in political giving between January of 2017 and 2019. The Tribune found that more than $120,000 went to campaign and political funds tied to just one legislator, State Senator Don Harmon of Oak Park. The Tribune found that PharmaCann's executives, their relatives, and lobbyists can be linked to more than $82,000 in political contributions, including some $51,000 to Harmon and his organizations. Joby Pritzker, the second cousin of Governor J.B. Pritzker, is a board member of the Marijuana Policy Project. That organization was credited by sponsors of the Illinois legislation as having helped write the bill. According to the Tribune, the group was among those to contribute to the campaign of State Representative Kelly Cassidy of Chicago, a co-sponsor who reportedly collected $13,000 in contributions. In addition to that,
so after that law, when it was passed, it was reported that Cassidy's spouse, Candace Gingrich, had gotten a job with Revolution in Florida as part of Revolution's Florida expansion operations. So she's denied there's a conflict of interest from the company's statements. She's just doing Florida stuff.
Also among the leading recipients of contributions from the state's marijuana industry was State Representative Bob Morgan. At the time, the Tribune found that Representative Bob Morgan accepted more than $25,000 in contributions.
Bob Morgan, he ran the medical program, and then after doing the medical program, he started to go into cannabis law. In between being a regulator and being a legislator, he represented some of the biggest cannabis firms in Illinois, GTI and Cresco and PharmaCann. And then he ran for office and he said, I don't do cannabis law in Illinois anymore. I don't do Illinois cannabis. From what I understand, he was still representing a cultivator in Michigan. So, he's still operating in the space. He's working in a completely ancillary business where he is not working for the company. He is, contracted by a company to do legal work.
Based on my review of the campaign finance data that is available on IllinoisSunshine.org, since the Tribune's review in 2019, cannabis companies and their political action committees have donated at least $248,000 to politicians in Illinois, with around $175,000 of those dollars going to one Senator Don Harmon, and around $70,000 of those dollars going to Representative Chris Welch. According to the Chicago Tribune, That number undoubtedly would soar if more information were made available to the public. Illinois state law prevents the public from seeing records that could show whether pot businesses have questionable funding sources or ties to unsavory people. According to the Chicago Tribune, that's proven problematic in another state-regulated industry, gambling, where revelations of reputed mob ties had sent officials scrambling. Concerns about lack of transparency reportedly came up a year before the passage of the law that legalized adult-use cannabis. Senator Heather Steins and Representative Kelly Cassidy, sponsors of the legislation, vowed to, quote, make ownership data completely accessible, end quote. Despite that pledge, their bill ultimately passed with a confidentiality provision that remains in place to this date.
You know, there's a lot of information about the regulation, enforcement, cannabis industry that's kind of under lock and key, protected by confidentiality.
When we think about legalization of marijuana, the money that was spent to advocate to pass it, we probably could have eliminated homelessness in Illinois.
Also, many of the direct cannabis regulators are involved in some way in the industry.
We have the director of the Division of Professional Regulation, Jay Stewart. Director? You?
Jay Stewart, who is like the director of the whole IDFPR from 2011 to 2016. He's now working with this company, Green Renaissance, Illinois. They have deep ties to state government. Degnan is a Cook County commissioner. She ran the medical program for a time too. She's part of a different applicant group called Americana Dream. Her deputy, Tara Meyer, is also linked to that company. A guy named Joe Wright earned the nickname the Cannabis King while he was running the medical program. He's got a consultancy based in Chicago, and he's also got this company called New Sierra that is out of Canada that does like cannabis oil. The most recent dude is a guy named Jeff Cox, who was running Bureau of Medicinal Plants in the Department of Agriculture up until last summer. And he jumped out and he started working for a consultancy called NMI Management Group that's led by two guys named Leonard Mailer and David Flood. For, I think, a lot of people who are like familiar with like cannabis stuff in Illinois, there's certain names that like stick out. Mailer and Flood seem to be much more low key, but they're tied to the Consume Cannabis dispensaries and Progressive Treatment Solutions. Flood was also principal officer of like the Business Association. It used to be the Medical Association. Now it's a different name. Records also show, but it doesn't appear from filings now, but George Archos, who is the head of Verano, which is one of the three biggest pot companies in the country. Archos was around when they founded this group. So a guy who doled out licenses to these people up until recently turns around and joins the group. Would be an issue if he were working directly in the state of Illinois. It'd be an issue with the revolving door law, but he appears to be kind of like circumventing that by working in other states. So also Senator Van Pelt.
Somebody say marijuana millionaires. Marijuana millionaires.
State Senator Patricia Van Pelt says she knows a secret to make you rich. But first, you have to pay her a non-refundable fee of $100 to attend one of her seminars. Van Pelt also boasts online about attending private meetings with Governor Pritzker and lead negotiators who are working now to legalize recreational cannabis in Illinois. But even though she's a public official, her seminars and secrets are not available to the general public. Van Pelt refused to answer questions about her scheme on camera, but did acknowledge she is selling ownership stake in her newly formed, privately held company, Wakana. And she said she hopes all Black-owned companies, including hers, win a state license to sell marijuana.
I'm riding away with the rich. Somebody say I'm riding away with the rich.
And then you have Toy Hutchinson was named as Pritzker's key advisor on cannabis, right? And when she was named, she was referred to as the cannabis czar. And then it was like, oh, well, no, she's not the cannabis czar.
Toy Hutchinson was originally supposed to be named to that position, but there is another Illinois law that says you can't take a position that you voted on as a legislator.
Oh.
So she voted on that as a legislator, and so they couldn't appoint her to it. So the governor had to create a whole separate position. So she is actually working in the governor's office as the senior advisor for cannabis issues.
And then they named Danielle Perry the Cannabis Regulation Oversight Officer. And then they started calling her the Cannabis Czar. And they were serving at the same time.
Hey, Danielle, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Obviously, Toy has left or is leaving. I'm not sure where she's at right now, but she's going to the Marijuana Policy Project, which was is a key lobbying firm that helped write the legalization law in Illinois.
I mean, I know intimately how this game is played, and whoever pays plays. I totally understand how this works. So you'll look and say, oh, these people don't really support her campaign. No, because I don't ask them to. There is a real fundamental problem in every state in this union, and it is called campaign finance. And unless we deal with campaign finance, people believe that if they elected me and sent me to represent their interests for my community, right? But in many, many cases, the people who are in Springfield are lobbyists, and they represent the interests of the cannabis industry, right? So there's no real effort to stop charging people, period, and arresting them, to allow people to have the freedom of expression when it comes to a plant. This is a plant, and they should have freedom of expression. If they want to grow it, they should be able to do that. And this concept of keeping the licenses constricted, that's the part that reminds me of an earlier period of time, the gold rush, right? The Homestead Act, right? These constrictions that the government is going to control who can get in and cannot get in. That's part and parcel to the reason why you have already seen social equity people going out of business.
More than 20 days before the new law took effect, Representative Ammons predicted most of what has been depicted throughout this entire video. This is the warning she gave before the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act officially became law.
It is not good enough that we simply expunge records for those of low-level marijuana possession. That is not good enough. That young black men and women have to walk around and be saddled with the results of this legislation going forward. We know that the people who are going to benefit from this are already benefiting. They're already benefiting economically. We know that black communities from the top to the bottom of this state are struggling economically, and this does nothing to solve that problem. And so I call on my colleagues to look at this issue as a justice issue and not a revenue one. We understand that the state is strapped for cash, but it is certainly not because black communities have stolen those dollars. We have been denied equal justice under the law, and we have been stopped at 3 to 4 times higher rates than any other community. And we call on justice today for our communities, and this measure must be looked at as simply a beginning and not an end. We will not stop fighting for our communities from this day forward. I refuse to vote on a bill that would not allow me to speak to it. And I hope that people of Illinois will do better for the communities who are suffering. Do not make them victims. Do not make them victims of our legislation. I want to acknowledge the profound need for justice for us, the untold suffering and evils that our people have suffered in this country, from slavery to emancipation, to post-Jim Crow era, to drug laws, and to the drug war. We have suffered, and we demand better from this institution. I hope that we are not doing the wrong thing by our community. I do appreciate all the work that has been done to get us to this point, but I don't believe we've done all that we can do to bring about justice and equity. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to speak today. And thank you so much for all that you do. Thank you.
a cannabis industry billionaire. And you know what? Things are going pretty goddamn well for me. I've established a firm regulatory foothold within several nascent cannabis markets across these United States. I've worked to ensure that nobody even has a chance to compete with me. You might be asking yourself, how did I do this? The answer is simple.
Cash money, bitch.
No, seriously, me and my VC bros Chad, Brad, and Thad poured at least $600K into lobbying in one state alone. I say at least because, of course, we weren't forthright with all of our political giving.
Oh! This is a venture capitalist knee. You see that fucking knee? Fucking do it the other way, too.
Transparency simply isn't the goal. The goal is complete domination.
Yeah, me and my buddies Kirk, Aiden, and McKinley are starting a rock band. We're calling it Regulatory Capture.
I'm quickly becoming the king of cannabis. The next industry that I plan to colonize is the psychedelic industry.
I'm relatively bullish about quarter 2, but quarter 3, let me tell you, it's looking beautiful.
Yeah, we should celebrate. You want some?
What is that?
Weed?
I don't smoke, but I'll try.
Check out my work at thecolememo.com. I interview drug policy experts, licensed cannabis operators, prostitutes, people in the cocaine industry, and more.